Well, Bide-In is now Bide-Out, and the Democrats need a new nominee. That's why today I am thrilled to announce that I am running for president. After all, there are lines on the White House lawn. I am sure that this will be a lot of... On second thought, let's just focus on what this means for the war. Because, like it or not, if you are interested in how Russia's invasion of Ukraine ends, you are stuck caring about US domestic politics. Indeed, Biden opting for a nice, quiet retirement is the most consequential thing to happen this year as it relates to the war. Far more consequential than the tiny shifts in territorial control that have happened over the last 6 months. Note the very small scale. And more consequential than Trump's assassination attempt. Indeed, as we discussed in the immediate aftermath of the failed attempt, political polarization among American voters appeared to be too high to move the needle much on that one, which in fact was the case. Now, there are 2 reasons why this is the biggest event. First, the differences in policy platforms, and second, the likelihood that either party gets elected. Let's start with the policy differences because that is the easier one to cover. We already know what Biden would have wanted to do with the war given 4 more years, because he already has a 3.5-year track record. What in part contributed to this drama, though, was a slight complication about implementing policy. At NATO's 75th anniversary conference earlier this month, US allies were concerned about a second Biden term, and not just because they, on average, don't like Trump and felt that Biden had a weak chance of prevailing in that matchup. Rather, there was palpable frustration in the room that Biden was losing his ability to lead. And if it was not an emergency right then and there, what might happen by 2028 was an even greater concern. In any case, the NATO heads of state were pleased overall with how the conference went. Now, 23 of 32 countries were meeting the goal of 2% of GDP on military spending, and more were on a pathway to do so over the next few years. Then, just as it all seemed to be going according to plan, at the end of the conference, Biden introduced Zelensky to give some remarks, but called him President Putin. Yikes. And that's where the media's attention went after the meeting. Not on the alliance hitting new spending goals, but on the Zelensky-Putin gaffe. Meanwhile, we'll discuss what might happen with the likely Democratic nominees in a moment. But suffice it to say that they will probably stay the course, but come with fewer Zelensky-Putin mix-ups. On the other side of the aisle, Trump's position is to reorient the United States for competition with China. That means leaving the Ukraine question up to Europe, and withholding further support to Ukraine, or at least most of it. There is also the bit about ending the war, but we have discussed before how that is more complicated than it seems. And then there is the general note that Trump is a wild card, so I am not confident about betting on any of what I just said. However, Trump's nomination of J.D. Vance, a noted skeptic of Ukraine aid, is a meaningful signal about what the administration will do more broadly, even if Trump's own opinion is liable to change on a dime. The second big point is the likelihood of having a president elephant versus a president donkey. It was not just the NATO heads of state growing frustrated with Biden. Dislike for both candidates has been high basically since polling on that began. But the recent movement to pull Biden from the Democratic ticket started after the presidential debate. To be blunt, Biden looked old and trailed off on many occasions as he spoke. Then the Zelensky-Putin thing happened. And then, in a press conference designed to take the heat off of that story, Biden discussed the great relationship that he had with Vice President Trump. Biden's poll numbers started to sag, which led prominent Democrats to begin bolting as the dominoes fell over. At one point, betting markets had dropped Biden's probability of winning the election in November, conditional on staying in the race, to 25.7%. Following Biden's announcement that he will withdraw, the betting odds for any Democrat to be in the White House in 2025 sat at 37.9%. This marks an increase from 34.5% right before the announcement. If that jump seems rather small, keep in mind that the betting markets had already priced in an expectation that Biden would leave the race. The 3.4% is just the extra bit from gaining final confirmation that he would indeed leave. You could also see this in how the Trump campaign decided to handle the long-running situation post-debate. There has been a noted drop in anti-Biden offensives, in large part because Trump allies benefited by Biden being the nominee. Even the Republican National Convention seemed relatively tame given expectations from a month ago. Well, as tame as one could expect when Hulk Hogan was one of the presenters. But let me tell you something, brother. That aside, Biden's decision to time his withdrawal on National Ice Cream Day retrospectively had another benefit. It prevented Republicans at the convention from going on the offensive against the Democratic candidate, whoever that person ends up being. That is also why, in this video, I am not looking at the polling numbers for hypothetical matchups, because they are essentially meaningless until the candidate properly introduces themselves to the American public for November, and after they go through the opposition's ringer. That takes us to the question of who exactly that will be, and what they will do with the war once in office. Immediately following Biden's announcement, the top 4 candidates in terms of the betting markets were Vice President Kamala Harris, Governor of California Gavin Newsom, former First Lady Michelle Obama, and Governor of Michigan Gretchen Whitmer. Brief caveat that these numbers will be volatile in the next few days. But that aside, let's begin with Kamala Harris, not to be confused with James Kamala Harris. Sorry, Hulkster. I will spend the most time focusing on her, given that she is the hefty favorite, and Biden immediately endorsed her after withdrawing. It also helps that Harris's job is literally the backup president. And like just about all other vice presidents, yes, including her, no one had really paid attention to what she has done during her time in that role, other than cast tie-breaking votes in the Senate. She certainly has been busy in that regard. However, Harris has at times been the chief surrogate for Biden on the international stage, and privately, she played a central role in the lead-up to the war. You might recall that the United States had accurately assessed Russia's intentions in the months prior to February 2022, that Putin was serious about invading, and that the world needed to get serious and prepare a response. Well, the rest of the world had a tepid reaction to those warnings. Nevertheless, the Biden administration continued to sound the alarm despite skepticism. Part of the reason for the administration's confidence came from the intelligence community's ability to withstand scrutiny regarding their own assessments. You see, every day, the White House receives something known as the President's Daily Brief. Think of it as the morning newspaper, except that it is prepared by the CIA and has all the dirt on everyone. A lot of the older ones are declassified, and they are indeed very interesting to read. It was France! And just imagine seeing this one on your desk on August 6, 2001. But as you are likely well aware, the United States has been burned by faulty and misused intelligence in the past, including the Biden administration's own mishandling of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Harris became a regular attendee of the briefings, and, in a throwback to her earlier career, played the role of prosecutor. Across the stand was the intelligence community. They played the role of the defense, and had to justify the briefing's claims under cross-examination. Biden found that check to be helpful in establishing confidence, which is part of why he was so public with the warnings about Russia. Of course, we do not yet know how Kamala Harris would act independent of Joe Biden on any foreign policy, including in regard to Ukraine. But given that she was looped in on the administration's policy decisions, it is reasonable to expect that Harris would be a close match to Biden. That presents some interesting questions for Ukraine to consider, as well as for Russia to consider. Much has been discussed in the media about how Ukraine was struggling to plan for the next 6 months, because strategists in Kyiv did not know who would be the president come January. That problem with uncertainty has gotten worse with Biden's exit, as Harris brings the odds against Trump closer to parity. That said, this discussion is a bit strange. If I had to guess, I think much of the general idea stems from the business world. When businesses do not know which regulatory regime they will soon be working with, they are loath to invest. This is because what would be optimal under one president might be completely worthless under another. However, war is not the same as business. Winning and losing is a zero-sum affair. And yes, the uncertainty makes it more difficult for Ukraine to know what to do. But it also makes it more difficult for Russia to know what to do. And it is not obvious which side faces the greater handicap in that regard. Anyway, that was just Harris. The other three will be harder to pin down. Oddly, Michelle Obama has the most foreign policy experience of the three of them, but all of that has come in a ceremonial role. Also, the reason her chances are that high are because she would be a potential consensus choice in the event that everything goes up in flames in the next month. So I think we should cross that bridge when we come to it. That leaves us with Newsom and Whitmer. Whitmer does not seem to want the nomination, while Newsom, who by all outward appearances really wants to be president, nevertheless also endorsed Harris shortly thereafter. Consequently, both of their betting numbers plummeted. Also worth noting is that Josh Shapiro, governor of the Great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, quickly endorsed Harris. This is noteworthy because he is the odds-on favorite to be the vice presidential candidate. However, all lines-on maps enthusiasts should be strictly against this, because if he is successful, I will be forever doomed to be the second most famous person with a political science degree from the University of Rochester. But in the event that something happens with Harris to make her candidacy infeasible, there is a more general lesson here regarding the other two. Broadly speaking, as it relates to the war, both Newsom and Whitmer have the standard Democratic record of supporting Ukraine. And it is not like either is a complete foreign policy amateur. This, for example, is Whitmer touring a base in Latvia. But there is a big difference between doing that with the title of governor, even of a state with an economy that ranks between India and the United Kingdom, and doing that on the national stage. And that, in itself, raises an interesting point. Remember, wars occur not because there is a substantive disagreement between two parties. The costs of fighting ensure a range of mutually preferable settlements instead. They occur because of a substantive disagreement, in conjunction with some type of bargaining friction. One major class of bargaining frictions is uncertainty. For example, how much a leader cares about the costs of war versus the other things that those resources could have gone to. Now, we have talked about that at length in regard to the Kremlin's miscalculation at the beginning of the war. But shifting focus, if the Kremlin thinks that the United States does not care, then it may make onerous demands out of Ukraine. But if the US leader has deep resolve, then the force of US aid will allow Ukraine to push back against such demands. Thus, you have continued war. When does such uncertainty arise? Well, one long-running line of research focuses on new leaders, which, hey, look at that, I'm a part of. When a leader has a track record in the foreign policy space, someone like a long-serving autocrat, it is hard for foreign intelligence organizations to have such yawning gaps in beliefs. But that logic is flipped when you have someone who is fresher in office. In the fresh case, you get fairly broad bands of possible expectations. In the more seasoned case, you get more narrow bands. As it turns out, it is easier to reach agreements in this case than in this case. Going back, the short reason is that trying to gamble out to here, instead of accepting down to here, does not make sense when doing so risks suffering your own costs of war. Biden is a well-defined entity, so you would have the smallest band. Meanwhile, Harris is vice president, so it is a starting point, but again, that is not the same as being president. As such, she's a bit wider. Then you have Newsom and Whitmer as the newcomers to national politics, never mind international politics, so that puts them on the end. Just for fun, if I had to put Trump on this list, well, goodness. Trump was one of those people that had massive bans when he came into office in 2016, because he had no political career at all before then. If we go back to the scale, the man would be all the way over here. After 4 years in office, he's somewhere in between those extremes. But my confidence regarding others' confidence, and yes, I did intend to say that, is quite weak here. However, what I said about narrow versus wide bands is true in a vacuum, without any other bargaining frictions and before any conflict has started. That is a bit different with Ukraine, as there remains debate on the bargaining friction that is causing the conflict in the first place, and thus it is unclear how that interacts with the uncertainty baked into one of the new, or once in future, presidents. So, as usual, the entire thing is a mess, at least in terms of the execution of the war, because Newsom or Whitmer would have to hit the ground running. They would have to defer much of the execution of support policies to Ukraine to the US national security professionals. And I can tell you with supreme confidence that they are much happier when political squabbles stay out of the execution of basic policy. Okay, that's all I got for now. Assuming there is no other crisis in US presidential politics, or any other new crises of other eventful natures, I will be back next time with a discussion of Russian casualties in Ukraine, and then soon thereafter with my longest video ever. In the meantime, you can check the video description for more information on these books about the war in Ukraine. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.